does fascism work, essentially? Does racism work? I think the answer is fairly obvious that it does. How do you best respond to it, though, is a question that I think is open right now. And on the line with us is Professor Jason Stanley. He's the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University, the author of 4 books, including most recently, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. We've done a book review of this book. We've played clips of it on the air. His Twitter handle, by the way, is Jason in INTRATOR. And Jason, Professor Stanley, welcome back to the program. You've been here before, have you not?
I have twice before.
That was my recollection. Thank you. So, in fact, in our previous conversations, we've talked about how the Trump administration is more and more resembling, not only in their actions, classic fascist governments, but in their campaigning, classic fascist campaign strategies. And I don't know if you want to, put an exclamation mark on that, but I'm curious your thoughts on how fascism can be defeated.
That is a great question. One thing to keep in mind is that we're not distinct from Europe and Germany in having a fascist past. The United States had a fascist past. The America First movement was a fascist movement. Hold on.
Sure. This was in the 1930s, as I recall.
The America First movement was a fascist movement.
Right.
Fascist movement. But what is distinctive about us is that we defeated our fascist movement internally. So we have experience defeating our internal demons.
You're talking about in the 1930s.
In the 1930s.
Right.
The America First movement was a fascist movement. Charles Lindbergh, as Bradley Hart has demonstrated in his book, Hitler's American Friend, the Nazis regarded Charles Lindbergh as a potential Hitler. Lindbergh was talking, the rhetoric we're hearing today is evocative of Lindbergh's rhetoric, except Lindbergh's rhetoric was even more explicit. Lindbergh talked about how the United States should ally with the Germans and the French and the English to defend the white race against the Mongol hordes and the Persians and the Arabs.
But at that point in time, Professor Stanley, we had a guy in the White House who was quite literally to the left of Bernie Sanders, who was proposing a second Bill of Rights where the government would guarantee not just your health care and not just your education, but your housing and your job as well. And was outspoken and aggressive and said, yes, they hate me and I welcome their hatred and things like that. Now we've got a guy in the White House who's talking like Lindbergh did.
That's right. We have a guy in the White House who's talking like Lindbergh did. On the other hand, FDR was not some sort of racial justice hero. He wasn't. So it's not like he was proposing the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
But we still defeated. So right. But you're putting your finger on it in the sense that we face an emergency in that we have someone who has vocabulary very similar to the extreme far right occupying the White House right now, and whether or not it's in his heart, what he's certainly feeding fascist ideology. But we have to remember, when you ask about how to defeat it, we've defeated it before. We're always fighting this in the United States. If you look at the Ku Klux Klan ideology, it is very similar to National Socialist ideology. The idea is that Jews are fomenting a race war to bring Marxism and communism and socialism to the United States, to try to defeat the Christian white ethno-state, bringing in immigrants. So we have that again. Except instead of Jews, it's Muslims or elites. You have a very similar structure right now. Islamophobia looks a lot like the anti-Semitism of the past, where the idea Hitler's we're supposed to focus on solutions, not problems. But right. So one thing to focus on is we've defeated this in the past, and it's part of our American history wrestling with this. Yes, it's a very dramatic situation in that the person fanning its flames occupies the White House. I don't think we've quite dealt with that in
Well,
the 20th
this was
century.
my concern, and I actually, I mean, this was kind of the point of a book I wrote called "The Crash of 2016," which was, you know, as you know, as an author, the publisher's title of your book. So it was an unfortunate title, but it was basically a title about how an economic crash can lead to a fascist takeover of the United States. And you know, I pointed out that in the early 1930s, the United States and Germany both equally suffered under the worldwide Great Depression. And we had FDR at the head, and they had Hitler at the head. And I think that more than anything else, both of those men were responding to the economic crisis in their own ways. And you can see, you know, how that turned out. And so I, you know, in my book, which was long before Donald Trump came along, I mean, his book was published in 2013 or 2014, I was suggesting that we have to be very, very careful as we dance closer and closer to an economic precipice, that we don't have essentially a Nazi in the White House, because we could end up going the way Germany did in '33.
Well, I think that the literature, the empirical literature on economic anxiety strongly suggests that Trump's supporters aren't the best predictor of Trump support is not having lost a job recently or even having a family member who lost a job. It's what psychologists somewhat misleadingly call racial resentment.
Right.
He's hitting racial resentment again and again and again. It isn't really, I mean, it's not like Black Americans who were completely hammered by the recession turned to fascism. So what we have is a politician who's not afraid of evoking the worst demons in American history in order to win elections. And we don't know whether that would have worked in previous elections, because politicians, although they did evoke racist tropes, including Bill Clinton, the Democratic Party, ending welfare as we know it, they did it in a coded way. And Trump is not coded. So he's leaning into this fascist past of the United States.
Right.
And, and one thing vis-a-vis your point about defeating it, I think American patriotism helps here. We've defeated this in the past. America is a story of facing this, and unlike Europe, defeating it internally. We have an advantage. The advantage is that a certain kind of ethno-nationalist story doesn't even prima facie make sense in our country. Like, maybe France and Germany and Norway can say to themselves, the citizens there can tell themselves something that's a myth even there, that they had the country, it has a unified language and a unified religion and a unified past, and everybody comes from this unified past. That story does not make sense in the United States. It doesn't even make sense in France because there were different groups and different there were Catholics and Protestants, and but it doesn't even prima facie make sense in the United States.
Yeah. So here we've got Tim Wise. This is a guy who ran the Democratic campaigns in Louisiana in 1990 and 1991, when David Duke ran for the Senate in 1990 and then ran for the governorship in 1991. And David Duke carried 60% of the white vote in that 1990 race in Louisiana. And what Tim points out is that in that 1990 race, the Democratic consultants told them, don't go after David Duke as a racist. Instead, go after his policies. And, you know, because if you call him a racist, you're somehow just enabling him or something like that. The bizarre logic. And so they followed that advice, and he got 60% of the white vote. The second time around, they said, to hell with the advice. We're going to just call this guy a Nazi. We're going to call him a racist. That's going to be the core of our advertising. We're not going to be talking about issues this time. We're going to be talking about his racism. And it caused his percentage of the white vote to go down to 55%, and it caused the Democrats to win in much larger numbers because it turned out the Democratic base. What are your thoughts on that as strategy and how the Democrats should be moving forward? We have about 2 minutes till we hit a hard break here.
Okay. So I'm in the first instance a scholar of fascism and propaganda and less of strategy. I saw that tweet thread by Tim Weiss. Tim Weiss's point was not that it tapped down the white vote, but that it brought people out to vote who otherwise wouldn't have voted. And I think that's promising. I think if you look at Michigan, for example, and this is as a non-expert in voting strategy, but if you look at Michigan, you know, again, you're not going to be able to win Trump supporters back. because they've been waiting for this guy all their lives.
Well, since George Wallace.
Since George Wallace.
Who, by the way, Michigan sent to the Democratic, Michigan was the only state that voted for George Wallace in the primary, in the Democratic primary in 60, whatever it was.
So you're not going to be able to get these voters back.
Right.
But you are going to be able to turn out younger voters. You're going to be able to turn out voters turned off who might otherwise have been apathetic. The 2016 election had a lot of people not showing up to the polls because there was effective propaganda, essentially, representing Hillary Clinton as, no different or just as corrupt as the president. So Tim Weiss is suggesting it's a strategy for bringing people out to the polls. And to me, it sounds right. I mean, as a scholar, my job is to just call fascism when I see it.
Right.
And that's what I'm doing. And
you're seeing fascism in the White House right now and in the GOP.
I'm seeing it's a continuum, so it's not an all or nothing thing. I'm certainly seeing transitions to fascism. He hasn't passed an enabling act, but stacking the courts, voter suppression. He hasn't overturned democracy, but he's put significant impediments in its way. So we're not talking Mussolini or Hitler by any means, but we're talking about fear about immigration and other characteristically fascist rhetorical tricks.